If you're like me, you've probably listened to or even participated in a few debates about the existence of God. Something that frustrates me to no end is when the theistic side makes a really good case for the existence of God. Like they come up with a good argument. Then the other side deploys the defense of, well, that's all well and good, but which God is it? They'll say, there are thousands of gods that people believe in, so how am I supposed to know which one is the right one? And isn't it arrogant for you to assume that yours is actually the one true God? And the reason I find this retort so frustrating is because it's a textbook red herring fallacy. If the dispute or the debate in question is whether or not transcendent divinity exists, to then complain that there are too many rival conceptions of this God who exists for it to matter doesn't do anything to refute theism or establish the truth of atheism. It's just a distraction from the core debate. It would be like a debate about whether or not the universe is governed by fixed physical laws or not, which to many of you who take for granted that it is, that might sound absurd to you. But long before we began devoting huge amounts of our resources to scientific observation, this was not a given. The world to many ancient thinkers appeared to be random, arbitrary, and chaotic. The belief that there are intelligible patterns to its behavior and governance depended on the triumph of philosophers like Socrates over the sophists, who believed that ultimate reality was just arbitrary and meaningless and therefore not worth investing the kinds of resources that we do today into trying to decode it. So imagine that we're in a position where we actually do have to try to establish that the universe is governed by such laws. And then after making a strong enough case for the existence of these physical laws, worthy of investigation, your detractor then says, well, that's fine, but there are thousands and thousands of rival conceptions about how those laws actually work. Isn't it arrogant for you to assume that your interpretation is the right one? I hope most reasonable people would say, no, it isn't arrogant. If you can accept that there are physical laws that can be detected and interpreted, you don't just throw up your hands and give up because there might be many rival interpretations, as there have been through history. You rise to the challenge of exploring truth for the sake of knowing what is true. So why the double standard when it comes to the existence of God? And even though this retort relies on a subtle fallacy, it further suffers from being wildly inflated. To claim that there are thousands of different gods to choose from implies that the task requires you to like organize each divine character as if in a police lineup and evaluate the credibility of their claims one by one. But like most things, all the various gods recorded in history and mythology can easily be categorized in a process of elimination that then reduces the apparent scale of this task to an extremely manageable size. And we know this from history because pagans did this all the time. Whenever the Roman Empire, for example, would conquer a new region, they would integrate the gods of that region into their own pantheon because a lot of the time they were virtually the same. It's like, oh, you have a god named Isis? Well, we've got one named Ceres, basically the same. Oh, you have a god named Osiris? We have one named Serapis, again, basically the same. This kind of syncretism didn't really bother anyone because everyone knew that this kind of polytheism was, again, basically the same thing across the board, just with a cafeteria of a variety of devotions. There was no rivalry between these devotions because everyone knew that polytheism, whatever its variations, was the same religion. So for the purpose of evaluating rival conceptions of divinity, you don't need to examine every single deity within a pantheon, because none of the polytheistic gods are proposed as the supreme ground of all being, or the unmoved mover, or the uncaused cause, as proposed by theistic arguments for God's existence. They're in a category that is entirely different. They are all understood and proposed as immanent beings that exist within our universe. But no argument for theism, including those proposed by ancient philosophers, were directed towards immanent pagan gods, but rather a transcendent God, who is the beginning and the end of all things. Those are two entirely different concepts, and to put them side by side, as if they need to be evaluated under the same genus, is a brazen category error. The kinds of arguments for the existence of God, whether they're ontological, cosmological, moral, or whatever, they do not apply to the pagan pantheon of gods because they aren't the first cause or the ground of being or the author of goodness. They are mere beings who are contingent and caused. God, by contrast, as argued for through religions like Christianity, is not one of the beings to be found in the universe. Even if you say he's the most supreme being, he is outside and wholly other than our universe. And frankly, the kinds of arguments that get used for theism, they simply don't apply if you're trying to argue for the existence of Zeus or Odin or Osiris. Belief in them was never based on logic, but on mythology and stories. Whereas theists have always understood that you can arrive at the existence of God through reason, through logic, through argumentation, which is why philosophers like Aristotle did just that. And while it's often claimed by atheist apologists that you can't prove that something is false, you can't prove a negative, it is the case with the pagan gods that you can prove claims about them to be false. Because again, they are understood as beings within our universe. So if Zeus, for example, holds court on Mount Olympus along with a cast of divine characters, well, you can climb up there, or in the contemporary age, you could fly up there with a helicopter to see if he actually is there in his palatial kingdom. So if you find that you can discount or strike off the polytheistic gods from your inquiry, then you've already taken the supposed thousands of gods and reduced that number to a very manageable size. You've removed most of the gods from the equation. So the next category you would look at would be probably pantheism, which is the belief that the universe itself is divine, that God animates the universe as you or I might animate our bodies. Now, the big problem that most people will have in practice, if not theory, with pantheism is that it holds that everything in the universe, every event, every object are part of the divine nature, which is why you can't object to anything you observe there. Any injustice that you perceive is a mistake in your own moral intuition. If you could only appreciate that from the divine perspective, these things are all perfectly fine. So like rape, war, greed, murder, all of these things are part of the nature of God, and any objection that you might have to them, well, that's a you problem. But, of course, every day we perceive injustices that aren't just a matter of our preferences being offended, but something fundamental to reality itself. The other problem I have with pantheism is that it forces you to adopt a conception of the universe as if it were a living thing like an organism. But that stands in contrast to the fairly sophisticated definitions that we have about that which is alive and that which is not. For example, a living thing is something that is self-organizing, something that grows and develops, something that reproduces. The universe doesn't do any of these things. Take organization, for example. A living organism, while it is alive, is constantly resisting the pressures of decay and entropy. It is holding its organized form against such forces, but the universe seems to be wholly subject to these effects. It's theorized by physicists and cosmologists that all of the organization that we observe in the universe, where there are things that are distinct from each other and have relationships with one another, producing the organization of these things, eventually will all break down into a vast uniformity and distribution of temperature and matter. That's what happens to dead things, not living things. When water crashes against a cliff, it erodes. When my skin cells get rubbed off, my body creates new ones in order to maintain the organization of my body. The universe doesn't seem to do that. It doesn't appear to have any of the fundamental traits of a living thing. And so if you discount pantheism, you're left with very few options, one of which is monotheism. And we're all familiar with monotheism because it has been the dominant form of religion for a long time. But it would be a mistake to think that this is the obvious form of religion that people just naturally arrive at. In fact, pantheism and polytheism are almost always the defaults wherever we have records of religious devotion. Monotheism is a massive leap and hardly ever made easily. Because remember what is being proposed by monotheism. It's saying that in order for there to be beings which have existence, there must be being itself. In order for there to be causes, there must be an ultimate cause by which all contingent things are explained. Like if I say to you, why do I exist? And someone says, well, because of your parents. That's not a complete explanation because they have causes too, and their causes have causes. If you just keep kicking the can down the road, you never arrive at a complete explanation and therefore invalidate the inquiry, and frankly, all inquiry. That's why an infinite regress isn't a good answer. It invalidates the question. So there has to be an uncaused cause and a grounding by which all existence depends, somewhere where that inquiry terminates. Furthermore, it has to be intelligent because the universe gave rise to intelligence, specifically us. But an effect, which we are, can't be greater than its cause. This is a logical principle called the principle of sufficient reason, which is widely considered valid in philosophy and science. So random, irrational processes cannot produce rational beings, but rational beings do exist, which means that our ultimate cause must be rational in nature. But while the ultimate ground of all being is something we can arrive at logically, and many have, we can't really know anything about it. Because by definition, God is beyond our comprehension. We are finite. We are limited. He is not. You can't fit 4 liters into a 1-liter jug, let alone the infinite inside our limited capacity to understand. So for us to know anything about God, aside from the fact that he exists, he would have to reveal that to us. Again, Aristotle knew by reason that there must be a first mover that sets everything in the cosmos in motion. But such a notion was so remote from us that we could hardly expect to have a relationship with this first mover. I also remember hearing a story about missionaries who went down to Australia for the first time and tried to evangelize the Aboriginals there. And when they started to talk about the one supreme God, in addition to all the pantheon of gods that they were familiar with, the natives started to get kind of restless and almost giddy. They knew of this one God who is the cause of all things, but they didn't speak of him. To them, he was so remote and mysterious that it was taboo or even blasphemous to talk about him. And I think that's a pretty good intuition about the God of ultimate reality, the God who transcends all of creation, or the God who created everything that is. Such a power, such a reality is so vast and remote that it's almost impossible to contemplate or say anything meaningful about. Again, that is unless he introduces himself to us. And this is what every monotheistic religion and prophet claims. They claim they've received a revelation from God and have been assigned the task of communicating it to the rest of us. Now, if we've arrived at the validity of monotheism, if you are persuaded by the arguments for monotheism in your inquiry, then the big 3 monotheistic religions probably are a good starting point, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of which have a prophet or prophets claiming to reveal God to us. But the obvious problem with prophets is that anyone can claim a knowledge of something that nobody else can really know anything about. So how do we assess a prophet claiming to possess that kind of esoteric or secret knowledge? I would argue that their claims would have to be accompanied by signs that could only come from God, confirming them as a prophet. In other words, they would have to have miracles associated with their work. God would have to signal to the rest of us that this person actually is a prophet. And in the case of someone like Moses, that's exactly what happened. He performed audacious spectacles and miracles in front of the people that he was calling towards himself, or calling towards God. And both Christianity and Islam affirm the validity of Moses as a prophet. But Moses, and then subsequently Judaism after him, claim that there is more revelation to be expected, and that a future Messiah or an anointed prophet and king of God should be expected. And the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible specifically says that the Messiah would come before the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem along with it. It also gives a timeline of about 483 years between the rebuilding of the second temple and the Messiah's arrival. And we're now 2,000 years after the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Romans, and contemporary Jews are still waiting for the Messiah, which seems to directly contradict their own scriptures. Okay, so what if we then turn to Christianity and Islam as contenders for the fulfillment of that anticipation? Now, interestingly enough, both Christianity and Islam actually affirm that Jesus was the expected Messiah, but they claim different things about him. Christianity says he was crucified by the Romans and then resurrected from the dead on the 3rd day, which was the ultimate proof, the ultimate miracle and sign of his divine origin. Islam, by contrast, claims that Jesus was not crucified because that would have been too undignified for a prophet of God. It also claims that Muhammad is God's last prophet and that his teachings recorded in the Quran are the correct ultimate revelation. So what's a more likely explanation then? That the New Testament of the Bible is correct, or that Muhammad's claims of revelation in the Quran are correct? Well, when evaluating the claims of the New Testament, which come from Jesus' own disciples who claim to have witnessed Christ's resurrection, you really only have two reasonable conclusions available to you. Either they were lying, that is, his disciples, either they were lying, or they were telling the truth about what exactly they witnessed. In considering the former option, it's worth asking, what motives would they, or frankly anyone, have to lie about being a source of revelation, to lie about being a prophet? Well, you might want to deceive people in order to acquire wealth or honor or power or sex, etc. All the worldly things that people have chased throughout recorded history. But if you were going to invent a religion to attract adherents in the ancient world, here's what you would not do. You wouldn't claim that the hero of your story was crucified by the Romans. Why? Because the crucifixion, or crucifixion itself, was considered an utter disgrace. It was a method of execution that the Romans used to exemplify their dominance. If your god or your hero suffered that fate, then he would have been seen as dramatically inferior and dishonored in the eyes of the ancient world. Crucifixion was also strongly associated with slavery because the empire relied on the subjugation of slaves, and crucifixion was an effective way of keeping them in their place. If slaves got out of hand, they would suffer the worst fate you could imagine. They'd strip you naked, scourge you, and then nail you to a cross publicly where you slowly died, often getting picked apart by buzzards before you breathed your last breath. Then they would discard your body in open pits that would produce an awful stench in whatever quarter of the city that was reserved for. It was the ultimate disgrace for anyone in the ancient world. If you were going to invent a religion with a character as your central figure that you wanted people to be drawn to, the last thing you would do is fabricate a story about him getting crucified by the Romans. And further, the story goes on to say that it was the witness of women who first reported the resurrection. This, again, is going to put your story at a massive disadvantage if you're simply trying to attract converts. Because the testimony of women was considered unreliable and hysterical. Women weren't even allowed to testify in court in ancient Israel. And yet, they wrote this into their supposedly fabricated narrative. And then add to it the multiple embarrassments that its leaders recorded of themselves, like Peter denying Jesus. If you wanted to look good in front of your potential converts, you wouldn't describe those stories about yourself, even if they were true, or maybe especially if they were true. You'd leave that part out. How about all of the disciples abandoning Jesus, save one, to his fate? Or how about their constant foot in mouth syndrome while they were always saying things that got them in trouble? You just wouldn't make those kinds of things up. And then when they were threatened with torture and death, they didn't renounce their story. They stuck to it until the end. Now, some claim big deal. Lots of people will die for their religion, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. People who die for their religion today are people dying for something that they hold to by faith. But the disciples of Jesus, they knew whether they were telling the truth or not. And if they were lying, then they died for a lie. Nobody would do that, because think about what a lie is. The only reason you would lie is as a means to another end. Again, to acquire money or wealth or whatever it might be. But if it's going to cost you your life, then the cost is too high, since the means aren't producing the desired end. The means, that is the lie, at that point would just get abandoned. But the disciples of Jesus did not do that. They suffered the fate that they did because they held to their story. They seemed more intent on humbling themselves than chasing after worldly prizes. So what about Muhammad, by contrast? Well, for one, he didn't even claim to perform miracles. And regarding those worldly incentives, Muhammad successfully acquired all of them: wealth, power, honor, and sex. He had a harem of wives and slaves. He had an army that he stood at the head of, and he ruled in the manner of any despot. He didn't renounce any of those things in the way that Jesus and his disciples did. So to accept the claims of Muhammad is to simply accept him based on his own testimony, which led to the kind of incentives most people would envy. To accept the word of Jesus and the disciples is based on miracles and the renunciation of all the things that might incentivize them to lie. So through a fairly simple process of elimination, it's pretty obvious that the claim to become a theist means the burden of choosing between thousands of different rival gods. It's actually entirely untrue. As many of you probably already know, I'm also a business owner and an entrepreneur, and a big believer in the idea of group preference. That is to say, that we should work with other Catholics as much as possible, Catholic companies and Catholic professionals, which is why I wanted to give a shout out to a company that I've worked with extensively. They're not sponsoring this video or anything, but like I said, they've done a great work with me, and I just wanted to give them some acknowledgement and some gratitude. So they're called Encode. They're a tech and software company. In my case, they helped me build a custom app. So if you are a tech startup or a company or an organization that has tech or software needs, they're offering, just out of their own generosity, a free hour of consultation for anybody who comes to them through me and through this little shout out. So if you go to encode.global/Brian, that's the way to redeem that, and hopefully experience a lot of the same merits in working with them that I did. And as always, thanks for watching that. If you liked it, then hit the like button. If you liked it a lot, hit the subscribe button. And if you want to support the work I'm doing, go to brianholdsworth.ca. There's a donate function there, or you can join me in my online community at Locals, or on my own website.